So, welcome everyone to day 2 of Business Resilience Training. On screen with me at the moment, I have Casey Moore, VP Content at Screen Queensland, and Ian Murray, our presenter today for day 2 from 113 Partners. I am now going to hand over to Casey to give us a little recap on yesterday and intro Ian for today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mel, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us again if you were here yesterday, or jumping in for the session if you're new in the space. As Mel said, this is the second part of our business resilience sessions with 113 Partners, and we're so lucky to have Ian Murray here talking us through this really valuable advice for companies during this period. If you were here yesterday, you may have heard us talking about uploading all the resources onto our website, and they're on the SQ Enterprise part of our website. So that cash flow template and the other resources that Ian was talking us through, as well as the slideshow from yesterday and today. The session is also being recorded, and that will be made available once it's been edited and tweaked on that same web page, so that we can all refer back to it, because as I'm sure you saw yesterday, there's lots of great tips and tricks in there. So I won't use up any more of the time. Let's get straight into it. It's a bit of a deeper dive into some areas today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Ian has to say. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Casey. So yes, today we're going to be moving into phase 2 of our sessions. I'm just going to, same as yesterday, I'll probably be sharing screen for most of this, so we can focus on that rather than having to look at my face. And hopefully I'm still there in the corner of your screen, so you can sort of see me there as well. So firstly, again, thank you very much to the team at Screen Queensland for putting this program together and for providing such great support to the industry. They're doing an incredible job, and they're all incredibly busy trying to get all these different initiatives together over there. So a huge thanks to them for putting these together. I would like to start again today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. For most of you who, I can see from the attendee list that many people are the same as what we had yesterday, so welcome back for those of you who are joining. For those of you who perhaps are joining us for the first time today, then just a little bit of housekeeping, which I'll just run through. We are using the Zoom platform. We will be having some questions and answer sessions a couple of times throughout this program, but you'll see at the bottom of your screen a little Q&A icon you can use if you do have any questions that you want to ask. Please use that. There obviously is chat function here as well. I really won't be looking at that too much as we move forward through today. I will be using it just to post links every now and then as we move forward. So if there are links which need to be posted in there, I will be popping those up there. But won't be necessarily actually following the information that's that if you're posting anything in there. So please use the Q&A icon if you've got any questions. What else have we got? There will be, yes, a number of files from today. Most of them are actually already up on the SQ Enterprise page, and I've posted that link in the chat for you already, so you can have a squiz at that. There on the left-hand side of the page of the Screen Queensland Enterprise page, so you'll be able to load some of those resources, and the ones from yesterday are up there as well. And as Casey was saying, this session is being recorded, so you can jump back in and review the information if you don't necessarily catch it this first time round, and that'll be posted. Those links will be up on that SQ Enterprise page as well at some point over the next few days. We'll be using a similar structure to the sessions as we did yesterday today, which means we're breaking into a couple of different halves. Each half will run for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll try to have about a 5 to 10 minute Q&A session at the end of each half. And if you want to take that time to go and have a break or stretch your legs or grab a cup of tea or anything like that, please feel free to do so. While yesterday was very much focused on the current state of business and some tips and tricks around how to manage in the strange environment we're finding ourselves in, today we're really focusing on the future state of the business and how we go about planning to get your business into some other shape to what it is at the moment. And of course, if you want to revisit yesterday's session, which was more around those current business environments, those are available there on the SQ side. Today will be the first half of today. We'll be talking about planning for the future. So this is very much looking at some of the tools that we look at when we're doing strategic plans. So we're going to be looking at the elements that we put into a strategic plan, what's important to consider when we're looking at how we're going to innovate or evolve the current business offering. We'll have a bit of a chat through some of those tools that you can use to review both the environment you're operating in and then how that relates to your own capabilities and ambitions within your own business as well. And we'll be having a look at some of the models that we use to rapidly test different growth strategies to see what impact that different scenarios can have on our bottom line profitability. It just means we don't need to go to all of the effort of building full complex models just to find out if a model's flawed. It allows us to really rapidly test top line business cases and see what works and what doesn't. So we'll have a look at some of those tools. After we've done all of that, we'll pause for some questions and go before we go into the second half of today's sessions. And that is specifically looking at your development activities. So in particular, we'll be considering how it is you go about figuring out what it is that you're focusing on within your business development activities, how those tie back to your core brand, and how you actually go about articulating what your core brand is. And then we'll also look at how you're going to take your business's products or services to market and the ways which you can do that. So that's the summary of what we'll be talking about today. We might just jump into it. So as we talked about yesterday, look, the world has changed significantly over the last few months. So it's probably more important than ever to understand the environment that you're operating in. Because it really does inform the way in which your business is going to operate. It's very easy for businesses to develop what we call muscle memory, how you've always done things. So that's great if you're learning how to drive a car or play an instrument, but it's not so good when the fundamentals of the environment that you're operating in suddenly shift. All of a sudden, all of those things that you're unconsciously competent at doing aren't necessarily appropriate for the new environment that you're operating in. So how do we avoid wandering into tar pits, I suppose is the big question here. How do we avoid becoming dinosaurs and being no longer relevant to the environment we're in? The first thing we do is we start that by doing a broad scan of our new environment. So for those of you who've attended some of the sessions I've done with SQ in the past at their premises, on business planning and things like that, you may be familiar with some of these tools I'm about to talk about, so please indulge me as I run through them again. But even if you have used some of these tools, even as recently as 6 months ago, it's definitely worth starting with a blank piece of paper and running through the process again, because as we were talking about yesterday, the world really has changed. So any environmental analysis that you may have done any time, even up as recently as March, is probably going to be out of date now. So let me back up a little bit and just talk about what is an environmental scan or environmental analysis. So when we think about our business isn't an isolated island floating in the middle of the Pacific. It's an active participant in a highly dynamic environment that's constantly evolving and changing with different pressures and catalysts, all reacting to create new threats and opportunities for our business. And over time, well, oftentimes these changes seem to take a long time. If we do a scan of a business environment one day and then we do the same thing a year later, oftentimes you'll see that very few things have changed and a lot of things will have stayed the same. But sometimes there are periods of considerable upheaval during which changes can be very rapid, and not being aware of them and what they mean for your business can potentially be quite detrimental to your business. So to understand how we go about running a resilient and sustainable business, we need to start by zooming out and really focusing on and considering the environment that we're operating in. To start this process, we generally do what we call a pest scan. Now, again, most of you, anybody who's worked with me in the past or who's seen these sorts of business planning workshops I've done in the past, you'll probably be familiar with this idea, but let me just take you through it again. So PEST scan, P-E-S-T, stands for political, economic, social and technological scans. So what it really encourages us to do is to look at these macro levers which are operating in the environment that we're participating in. So from a political perspective, what we're looking at is changes in legislation, changes in or potential future legislation, regulatory bodies and pressures, changes in government policy. If there's actually been a change in government, either at the state or federal level, that often impacts on a whole bunch of different elements. So it may impact on the funding of grants and things like that. Trading policies, they've been updated. So whether we have international co-production treaties and things like that, they're all important to be aware of. Funding, grants, initiatives, things like that. Any market pressures at home or internationally, wars or conflicts in, and obviously pandemics in today's environment. So, and how that's happening in a political environment is really important. So one of the big impacts that we've seen recently, or perhaps not so much of an impact yet, but which potentially has got the chance to be an impact, has been the relaxation of quotas for broadcasters. So that's an example of something which is very much happening at the political level. Economically, then, we're looking at things that are happening at economic trends. So again, kind of pertinent for today's market, where we've got fairly significant economic upheaval, which is going to have a flow-on effect in many different ways. Other things to consider there is going to be taxation, seasonality issues, any market or trade cycles, foreign exchange, things like that. Again, the Australian dollar, how it's comparing to US or UK or other international currencies, especially when it comes to engaging with international platforms or consumers, how that all works together. Distribution trends, interest rates and things like that as well, or international trade and monetary issues. So they're all economic sorts of things that we need to be considering. From a social perspective, what we're looking at is lifestyle trends, demographics, consumer behaviours, consumer attitudes and opinions. Their way, we often talk about the way in which there's been a shift of how people have been consuming media sits within that sort of social element, although it does also sit in the technological element to a certain extent. Any laws which have changed, social factors, privacy issues and things like that. Consumer buying patterns sit in here. I was just saying just before we started this, I was just reading some of the research about the uptick in people buying video games and spending on gaming over the last couple of months has been considerably increased as people have been spending more time at home. So understanding those sorts of trends and how they potentially going to impact on us is important. Major events, buying access, advertising and publicity, ethical issues, all sorts of things like that sit within that sort of social quadrant. And lastly, technological. So evolutions in technology, competing technologies, changes in pricing in that space, research funding, any dependent technologies which you have which impact directly on your business, the maturity of technology, so whether or not the particular technologies which you're using to drive your business are reaching maturity and about to be superseded by something else, which can have a flow-on effect into capital expenditure and things like that. Information and communications, all of the technology we're using to do things like webcasts and things like that, which and many of those elements we were talking about yesterday when it came to communications and changes to how those types of behaviours are occurring as a result of technology. Technology legislation or innovation, access to technology, licensing, patents, intellectual property, things like that. So we're really spending time when we're doing our pest analysis looking very much at a top-line view of the environment we're operating in. It's important to do because there's no point in creating products or services that the market is actively trending away from. And the only way you can sort of identify that is by stepping outside of your day-to-day business and looking at what's happening at this sort of broad macro environmental level. For instance, if you had decided in the late noughties that you wanted to get into CD manufacturing, you probably wouldn't have done a very thorough pest analysis before you decided to make that decision. So identifying those sorts of market trends where we can see that there's going to be a decline over time so we can then shift our business or our focus is really important. When you're doing a pest analysis, it's really important to just point out that you're not actually looking at your own business. So you're not considering the characteristics of your business when we're doing this. We're really looking just at the environment that we're operating in. So try to avoid the temptation when you're doing your pest analysis of tying it back to the environment to tying the environment back to you at this point, because we absolutely do get into that in some of the next steps of the environmental scans that we do. But at this point, we're keeping it really top level. Once we've completed a scan of the macro environment, then we need to start looking at ourselves. And this is a model that most people are more familiar with. It's called a SWOT analysis, SWOT. Before I get there, one of the pieces of materials that we actually have included on the SQ page is just a sample pest, because it's something which I think people do find useful to be able to see a worked example of one. And this is one that we did at Screen Forever last November. And you'll see when you have a look at that what I mean about the fact that things have been changing fast, because while there are still some elements of that analysis which are relevant today, there's also quite a few things that simply don't have the same relevance as they did 6 months ago when we did that piece of work. So yes, let's move on to our SWOT analysis. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So that's what our SWOT, S-W-O-T, stands for. We tend to do it in a quadrant form again, so into 4 quarters on a piece of paper, but you can do it however works for you. We start really by looking at our own strengths and weaknesses. So as a business, what are we good and bad at? What are our capabilities, or what are our skills deficits? What do we have a good reputation for, and what do people perhaps not come to us for? So really understanding those things. So the top 2, strengths and weaknesses, really are around things which are directly related to our business and our current capabilities. The bottom 2, opportunities and threats, are really useful to start thinking about immediately after you've done your pest analysis, because what we're really looking for then is the information that we've been analysing there, so we can start to think about, for our own business, what's happening in the broader environment that we're operating in, and how does that actually impact on us. So at this point, we're trying to simply list everything out. We're not prioritising anything, we're just trying to map out who you are and how it relates to the environment, and how who you are relates to the environment that you're operating within. When you're doing your opportunities and threats, you'll probably also find that many things seem to be 2 sides of the same coin. So if something is an opportunity, there's possibly also a threat associated with it, and vice versa. If something's you've identified as a threat, there may also be an opportunity there for you, because our opportunities and threats are things in the external environment that we can be potentially moving our business towards to take advantage of, or to mitigate against. So again, SWOTs, good just to start with a blank page again. Your strengths and weaknesses perhaps haven't necessarily changed over the last 6 months, but the opportunities and the threats of your external environment probably have. So if you start by having a look at that broad macro environment from a pest, that really helps you to start to inform what your opportunities and threats are going to be in your SWOT component. Now, oftentimes people only ever do the SWOT, and that's fine. It still is a valuable exercise to go through, but it doesn't necessarily help you think about what the next actions are that you need to take as a result of the analysis that you've done, because of the opportunities and threats and what it actually means for you next. So what we encourage people to do often is the next stage from a SWOT, which is what we call a SWOT action plan, which is starting to compare some of those quadrants on your SWOT and seeing what it actually means for you. So sorry, give me a moment then. So yeah, this is in my mind, this is more of the fun part, because now we're starting to get into the actual actions of what it is that we need to be doing, and helps us to inform the strategic direction that we need to be heading in. When we look at the list of opportunities and threats that we've come up with, what we are really starting to do is to compare those at the bottom of your page, if that's how you've done it in the quadrant, to the top 2 with the actual characteristics of your own business, the strengths and weaknesses. And then that starts to inform the actions and the direction we want to take. So the first one that we often look at is that we compare our strengths to our opportunities, where there's a clear alignment between those 2 things, where we have obvious strengths within the business and some opportunities that align with those. Those are what we call obvious priorities. These are the things that we can do immediately, that we know will have a positive impact on the business without having to do anything fairly significant in upskilling or changing your current resourcing. The next one that we tend to look at is our weaknesses versus our opportunities. And these are the things that we feel we should be able to do and take advantage of these opportunities. But for whatever reason, we're lacking in some sort of resource or capability that allows us to take advantage of those opportunities. So they're what we call our attractive options. These are areas that we would really like to be able to move into. They're probably our secondary port of call in terms of when we're starting to prioritise things. They're not necessarily the lowest hanging fruit, but they're really attractive options because they're good opportunities which, with some relatively, with some identifiable changes to our business, we can start to take advantage of. Down the bottom left-hand corner there, you'll see that we've started to compare our strengths to our threats, and these are things that are easily defended against. So we can use the information here to start to develop mitigation strategies to help us avoid or minimise the particular threats that we've identified, which we can counter using strengths or capabilities within our own business. And then lastly, in the bottom right-hand corner, we compare our weaknesses and our threats. And this gives us our high-risk threats. These are things which we're not presently equipped to deal with. Some of them we may be able to mitigate against in some way by developing some sort of capability. Otherwise, they may be things that we simply can't mitigate against, but we just need to be aware of them so that we can keep an eye on them, and if they do become problematic for us, then we can, at least we're aware of what they are and what they mean. So yeah, weaknesses and threats are probably the hardest thing to actually develop an action plan against, unless it is around developing some form of capability or skill to help moving them into that easily defended territory. So the SWOT action plan's outcomes is really starting to move into that space of having activities and actions. So because we've learned from this analysis, it allows us to start considering what we actually need to start doing next in our business based on this information. So instead of just doing it for the sake of doing it and to demonstrate that you've done the environmental scan, what we're really trying to get to here is actionable items, actionable outcomes, which are clearly justified and articulated on the basis of the environment that you're operating in, and then the capabilities that you have or lack of capabilities. And so that informs the business activities you're going to take next. Another activity that's worth undertaking after you've finished your SWOT action plan is to map out where your business sits in your immediate business environment and comparing that to your competitors. So to do this, we generally plot a graph with an x-axis and a y-axis. The one which is up on screen, it's just a dummy one. It's not real. It's not based on anything in particular, and isn't supposed to show you anything other than just what it actually looks like when we start to plot these things out. The characteristics that you actually choose to map on each of those axes will be dependent on your business and what you see as being your key differentiators between you and your competitors. So this is a competitive analysis map, and this is really allowing you to sort of see where you sit in your environment compared to the people that you have identified as being competitors. So the axes that you might consider using across the bottom and down the side here would be things like maybe quality of work. So how high quality is the work which is being done, or what's the price point? Is this if you're in a production environment, for instance, is this a businesses operating with fairly small businesses or really large businesses? Very small budgets or very large budgets. So what's the price point that they're working at? Other ones that you might consider would be things like creativity. So what's the quality of the creative which is happening there? Or reputation. What's the actual reputation that these businesses have? Or also, what's the target market? Are they focusing just purely on a domestic and niche local market, or are they focusing completely internationally? So picking those axes on your graph can take a little bit of time, and sometimes what we do is we run 2 or 3 different versions of these until we actually sort of see if there are some trends emerging when we start to plot these things out, and then looking at where we sit on that environmental scan in a competitive environment compared to other people. When you start to map your competitors onto a graph like this, what you really are hoping to do, or what you're hoping to find, is that there's clusters of businesses in particular areas, and then gaps in the market in others. So what you'll often find is that when you start mapping people against and competitors against these 2 axes, is that you'll often have people coming along the diagonal axis, where the bottom left is going up to the top right, or whichever way it's going to go, depending on which scale you've used. And so, for instance, if you were to use cost and quality, which are often the two simplest ones to use. So if you had cost across your bottom from low cost to high cost, and you had quality from low quality to high quality, what you'll probably find is that you're going to have a diagonal trend of competitors in there, with low cost, low quality people going up to high cost, high quality people. And then everybody in the spectrum in between there. And what you'll probably find when you start to map these out is that there's very few people sitting in the low cost, high quality quadrant, or the high cost, low quality quadrant, simply because there's no market or business model that can really service those gaps. So it's an important thing to consider, and we do talk about this a little bit when we're doing these sorts of activities, is to say that just because we've identified that there's a gap in the market doesn't necessarily mean that there's a market in that gap. Mm-hmm. So as you start to map this out, then it's really important to start looking at whether or not just because we've identified that there is a particular gap in that continuum, there may be an actual reason for that. But equally, it may be that there's a market opportunity there which isn't being serviced by any of your competitors. So that's the purpose of going through and doing some of this competitive analysis. Screen Queensland's business plan template, which they have provided, also has a good matrix there for you to help when you're considering who your competitors are and what their characteristics are. So it's absolutely worth using that matrix to sort of go through and to map out who they are and some of those other questions which are asked in their business plan template. It is important just to consider as you go through that process, though, that what you're really looking for isn't who your competitors are today. So forget the muscle memory. What we're really looking for is who our competitors to our future business activities are likely to be. So when we're doing a strategic plan, we're really looking at who are our competitors likely to be based on what it is that we're going to be moving our business towards. So just a quick recap there on environment scans. Why are we doing them? We're doing them firstly to demonstrate to people who are reading any strategic planning work that we've done that we have genuinely considered the environment we're operating in. So we're not just picked an idea and run at it without actually giving any thought to why we're doing that or whether it's actually going to be relevant. We've demonstrated that there's a connectivity all the way through from that macro environment through to our own specific business, and then the actions which we're going to take off the back of it. So it means that the actions that we're describing in our strategic plan have got a rationale going all the way back to our macro environment. So that's the first point. The second thing that we want to do is we want to try to avoid building a business in a space where there simply isn't a market opportunity. So by doing this analysis, it allows us to identify whether or not there actually genuinely is a market opportunity in the space that we're trying to describe, and ideally a sustainable business opportunity there, a business model, not one which is going to be in decline, going back to my example of CD manufacturing in the late noughties. If we go through this process and we can sort of start to see those opportunities, and we can also avoid building businesses where those opportunities are in decline. And we're also trying to look for those white spaces where we can potentially carve out a niche or take advantage of a shift in our environment. So especially in times like now where there have been fairly seismic shifts in the environment we're operating in, that potentially means that there will be opportunities and white spaces or gaps in the market where people aren't necessarily servicing a particular area, and which may provide an opportunity for us. So that's our competitive analysis and a competitive mapping process. And again, this just sort of gives you the image on screen is really just to give you a sense of what it's going to look like, as opposed to what the axes are that you're going to pick, or who the actual competitors are going to be that you're actually working with. The next point that we really want to go into is then how you can then grow your business. And this is a model that we often use when we're considering working with businesses who are actively looking at ways of growing their business. So when they've either hit a threshold or feel like they're unable to grow their existing market any bigger than where they presently are, this is what's called an ANSOLV matrix. An ANSOLV matrix was developed back in 1957 by a Russian-American mathematician or applied mathematician and business manager by the name of Igor Ansov. But it's as relevant today as it was back in 1957. And it suggests that there's 4 logical ways of growing a business. So from our bottom left-hand corner, we have our existing products and our existing markets. So really what we're looking at here is selling more products and services to your existing markets. And so that type of strategy is called market penetration. It's all about increasing market share within your existing market segments. How do we go about doing that? Aggressive promotion and distribution, potentially price decreases, acquisition of rivals or other businesses who are operating in the same environment. So it's really just about market share is really what we're trying to do there. That's probably the space which most people are operating in by default, in that you're not necessarily constantly looking at ways of innovating either in a product or a market perspective. And so as a general rule, you're sitting in a normal market penetration model, which is just around trying to increase your share of the markets that you're operating within. Market penetration as a strategy is fairly low risk, but it's also low rewards, and oftentimes, as I say, it can be driven by decreases in price and profitability in order to gain greater market share, which isn't necessarily good from a long-term perspective. The next thing you can consider is selling your existing products and services into new markets. So that's in our top left-hand side of our quadrant. This is called market development. Market development requires minimal product development or innovation, and really what we're looking to do is to find ways of shifting to identify new markets. So that may be, for instance, if you have a product which is business to consumer at the moment and made available. So if you've got a digital product which is being made available specifically for consumers, there may be a way of also making that available to businesses. So shifting from a B2C to a B2B model, or vice versa. If you've got a product not dissimilar to what we're working with at the moment. So Zoom, for instance, which was very much a business-to-business tool, is probably being used for business to consumers, or or consumer to consumer now. So they've probably uncovered some new markets as a result of the environmental shifts which are happening. So finding and uncovering new markets which perhaps didn't exist before is really key to this sort of market development. You may also be able to find new areas or regions in the domestic market that you're already operating within. International market expansion is probably the most obvious one that we talk about when we're looking at new markets. So if we've got existing products that we can sell to new players or to new territories around the world, that's a really good example of market development. So going and spending more time selling to the US or to the UK, or selling to emerging platforms if you're a TV or film producer, or the streaming services which have only emerged over the last 5 to 10 years, are all examples of new markets that we can be selling to. And so engaging and setting strategies to engage with those new markets is all around market development. It works really well when you've got a unique product that you could potentially sell into other territories. So if you have got something special about what it is that you do, then that can absolutely work well in terms of finding new territories to sell that into. And it also works well where the new markets that you're expanding into tend to be similar to the ones that you're already existing in. So what I mean by that is, for instance, that it's probably going to be easier to sell English language programming to other English language countries than to foreign territories. So that's just a really simplistic version of what I'm talking about there. But yeah, if you can find territories which in some ways are similar to the ones that you're already selling in, then we'll probably find it easier to sell into those territories as well. The third quadrant that we're looking at here, which is our bottom right-hand corner, is then looking at developing new products and services for your existing markets. And this is called product development. It comes about from an investment in research and development. Sometimes it can be acquiring the rights from somebody else's product for local commercialization. So if somebody else is doing something great internationally, format sales are a good example of that from a television perspective. So we're buying in a international format or idea, and then we're making it appropriate for the local market. So that's like an example of product development. Also buying in and badging something as your own. So if there's a product or a service which is available in a different territory which isn't available in the current one, you can import that, buy it in some way, rebadge it as yourself and sell that. White labeling is a good example of that from a technological perspective. It also can be joint venture partners, so looking at partners who are in other territories who've got particular products which they've developed and they want access to the markets you're already operating in. So for whatever reason, it may be, for instance, that they want access to the Australian tax benefits they get from creating content here or things like that. So from a film and television perspective, that's a good example where you can enter into some sort of joint venture arrangement so that you're getting access to somebody else's product and they're getting access to your existing markets, and so everybody gets that benefit. And lastly, probably most complicatedly, we have in the top right-hand corner the idea of selling new products and services to new markets, and that's called diversification. It's tricky. You need new skills because obviously you're trying to sell something completely new to people that you don't know. It's often done via acquisition. So instead of trying to start out completely independently, it's often done by actually buying another business which already has capabilities and existing clients in that territory that you're looking into. So both products and clients in that territory. Where it doesn't work is where it's done out of desperation. So sometimes you'll have a failing business and they will try to completely pivot their business by totally diversifying and moving into new products and services where they simply don't have the skills or the capabilities or any of the relationships. And that doesn't necessarily work when it's done out of desperation. Where it does work is where you've got some sort of related type of activity happening. So for instance, vertical integration, either a distributor buying a production company, for instance. So they're buying capability in a new territory, which is also going to support their core business, or a production company buying a post facility. So again, you're looking at a way of buying additional capabilities and products and services which aren't part of your core offering, and potentially doing that for a market segment which you aren't necessarily selling to at the moment, but if you've got knowledge of and understand that marketplace, then that can work better. So vertical integration is often an example of where good diversification can work. And that can be done by way of joint venture or by way of mergers as well. So it's not necessarily about just having to buy somebody else. This can also be about identifying key suppliers or key customers where there is opportunities for vertical integration, exploring those as a way of diversifying your business too. Each one of these quadrants represents different risks and rewards for a business. The framework's useful in helping you to start to identify some of those ways of growing your business. So it's a useful way of thinking about things. For instance, if you're a television producer and you wanted to explore market development in particular, then you could be considering what the emerging markets for your existing products are. Who can I be selling my existing products to? And when I say existing products, that could be tape sales, or it could be sales of ideas or formats or shows that you're working and developing at the moment. So this may be another territory around the world. It may be a different type of platform. You might decide that you've got something which is going to be really great for Quibi, who's just emerged, for instance. And you go through the process of identifying who those potential new customers for your products are, and then you develop the strategies to find and engage with them. So this just again gives us a framework to start to think about the strategies that we want to start to do within our businesses. Alternatively, take same example, television producer may decide that you want to explore what opportunities there are that exist to sell your new products and services to your existing clients. So perhaps not with television. Let's think about this more from a games developer, for instance. If you've got a highly engaged audience, you may decide that it's much easier to develop a new product for your existing audience who already know and love your games, rather than trying to develop the strategies to sell your existing games to a new client. But all of these strategies are going to be suitable for different businesses at different stages of their development. So these again just different ways of thinking about going about setting strategies and development activities for your business. Diversification, as I said earlier, is probably the most risky tool in the Ansell matrix. It's the most risky way of approaching things, but it's also potentially the most rewarding because it allows you to not just engage in those diversification activities, it also allows you to engage in both product and market development activities as well. So it effectively gives you 3 new avenues to growing your business rather than just one. But it is the hardest and the most resource intensive, and you do run the risk of neglecting your existing core markets by going down that diversification path. So it's worth just bearing all these things in mind as you start to plan out, where these sorts of things sit in terms of where you'd like to take your business. But it's a very useful tool in identifying how you're going to move outside of doing what it is that you're doing. So when it comes to innovation and diversification of your business and product model, it's an interesting way of thinking about things. Moving on to backwards planning. So backwards planning is a tool that we often use to evaluate the risks and rewards of different strategies in a really top-line model. And what I might do is break out of this slideshow in a second and actually show you an Excel version of it, which is the one which is available for you to download on the Screen Queensland Enterprise page. But it's an Excel model. It's a finance model that we use. And we use it to build backwards from a desired end state. We go, where is it that we want to end up? Generally, we're setting that around profitability. And then we manipulate a fairly small set of variables that underpin our business model to test various scenarios and see what's required to achieve that desired end state. So we work backwards from the end state to where we currently are, and then we sort of build up towards that by playing around with a bunch of fairly simplified variables. So the backwards planning template, which is available for you as part of the materials, I'd encourage you to download. And as I say, I'll just pull that up on the screen quickly now so you can have a look at what that looks like. It probably does require a little bit of explanation as to what these things are. Okay, so things which are worth considering when you're looking at this model. Everything which is in blue are the areas which you can start to play around with and change your data sets for. The first thing which I was talking about earlier is really starting with what is it that we are anticipating we're going to be ending in terms of what's our final position point from a profitability perspective. In this case, where this model is completely driven around trying to get from a starting point to a finishing point with profitability. And what I've loaded in here at the moment is just an endpoint of $250,000 EBIT, so earnings before interest and taxes, which is just a proxy for net profit, and a starting point that we're starting off at say, a $50,000 anticipated profit in the first year. So what this model is then doing is calculating the linear progression between those 2 points to tell you what your targets for each year are. So if we said we actually want this to be $1 million at this point, it will go through and will recalculate what that linear progression needs to look like, depending on what your starting and finishing points are going to be. So you can sort of see what those targets are likely to be for your business model. So that's just about setting those things. The second thing we need to consider is then what are the products and services that you're selling within your business. So we go through and we populate this section of the model with each of these things. So again, I've just put in 10 random placeholders here. You can change these to widget 1 or whatever you'd like to, and that will also update throughout the rest of the model as you make these changes here. The other two important things to consider here is what's the actual price point that we're selling a particular product or service at. So it might be $100,000 for a particular product, and then what's the margin that we're anticipating going to make off of that product. So what is our net receipts that we're going to have after all variable costs outside of our fixed overheads that we're anticipating we'll be able to retain in the business. So it may be, say, a 15% margin that we're going to make. So on that basis, of our $100,000 product or service 1, $85,000 of it is going to go out the door as a variable cost, and we will maintain $15,000 of that in this scenario. So we go through and we build out each of the products and services there that we're anticipating that we're going to be selling in this top section of the model. Their price points, their margins. The next thing we're looking at then is our fixed resources. So what are our fixed overheads of the business? And at this point, we're excluding staff. So if we say our fixed expenses outside of salaries, our rent and all of our other expenses is $100,000, we can load that into here. We've also got a model here which allows us to look at what the growth rate that we're anticipating that fixed expense is going to increase by year on year. So you can start tweaking those figures. If we think it's going to be smaller than 10%, we can make those changes, or it can be variable over time as well. So how that works, actually I can see this logic isn't working on this one at the moment. I'll update this and give you a fresh version where the logic's working properly in that. So when you download it, that will actually work all the way through. That's just locked in at a fixed 10% at the moment. Let's do that one in there. And then the last thing we want to do is then look at the staff costs that we have. So what are our staffing salaries that we're anticipating we're going to have over the next few years? This is a 5-year model that we've built here. We can extend that out for as long as we need to. But really what we're doing is putting in there what are the roles that we're anticipating we're going to be engaging with, and what are the salaries that we're going to be paying for those roles over time. And again, we can sort of have a variable increase in terms of how much we're increasing those salaries by year on year. Now, it may also be that you're not bringing in people all in year one. It may be that you're going to stagger those things so you can start to drop people into subsequent years as well. So really what we have at this point is just a model of what our costs are going to look like, and then we've got our schedule of all the products and services we're selling, and then we can start to play around with the volume of how many of each things we're going to sell. So if we think we're going to sell 5 of a particular product, if we're going to sell 5 of these in the first year, that will flow all the way through, and we can start to see what the impact of that's going to be. So as we populate the rest of this model, what it allows us to do is to sort of very rapidly just sort of see the impact of what the variables are which are likely to impact on the profitability and the bottom line profits of this business. And it's all, you've got a little graph there which you can sort of use to sort of keep an eye on that as well. So let's go back to our presentation for a second. So yeah, so what we're really looking there is how many products, what's the volume of each product and service that we can sell, if we can quantify the metrics around each of those. And then what the model quickly does is it allows you to sort of have a really quick view of what that means in terms of, after deducting overheads, including your staff costs and your fixed costs, it gives you a sense of what your profit is going to be there. Now you'll see in there I'm calling profit EBIT. Again, I'll give you a slightly updated version where the logic's not broken in it. EBIT is an acronym for earnings before interest and taxes. So this is the most common model that we use when we're considering the profitability of a business. And by playing around with the different volumes, you can see that you're going to have different outcomes depending on the mix of activities that you think you can actually output to achieve your goal. It's worth noting that you may want to increase your fixed overheads or your staffing costs over time. So as you're running different versions of these models, you might say, well, I can deliver 3 of product type A if I have this existing staffing levels, but in order to increase my volume of those to 10 or 15, then I'm going to need to put on these additional staff members. They may be salespeople or producers or whatever the case may be. So it just allows you to really quickly do those sorts of calculations in a really simplistic sort of model without having to get too complex and to just test different scenarios. Really what we're looking for is more than anything is validating that what we anticipate is viable in our business actually is going to work from a profitability perspective. If we suddenly discover that in order to create the business that we want to create, we need to be outputting 10 feature films a year at $15 million budgets, that's going to probably be quite problematic for us, well, unless we're a very large studio to begin with. But what it allows us to do is to validate our top line business models before we spend all of our effort in terms of researching and developing and doing really detailed plans for models. So it's a good way of just doing some top line testing. And then once we're comfortable with a generic model which appears to work, then we can start to drill down to do the deeper analysis on each of those business models and business cases to actually see how that's actually going to play out in the real world. You're much better to do it in a simple model than spending hours and hours or days and days developing a really deep business model, which then you suddenly discover doesn't stack up when you've done your more detailed 3 or 5 year detailed finance planning. Again, what we don't anticipate, even though your backwards plan gives you a fairly good sense of the viability of a model, you won't really see the granularity of what that means from your cash flows and from your actual profitability until you start to build that into a much more detailed finance model. But as I say, in terms of rapidly testing and testing ideas and models, it's a really quick way of doing that. So please have a play around with that. If you have any questions on that specifically as you start playing with that model that you want to reach out to me, just reach out to me on email or any of the other ways you can reach me, phone, Slack, whatever you've got access to ask those questions, and I can help you sort of figure out how to use that model a little bit better. We can jump on a Zoom call or whatever you need to do. Next point before we get to our break, actually second last point before we get to the break, is going to be marketing. So marketing is one of those areas that many people who work in the creative industries really hate and tend to avoid. For those of you who attended yesterday's sessions, marketing is often that frog that you need to eat. So for those of you who didn't attend yesterday's sessions and you're wondering what I'm talking about, then it's probably worth looking at yesterday's session at some point and understanding about eating frogs. But marketing doesn't need to be complicated or painful. By starting with a really simple framework, you can develop an appropriate marketing plan for your business and chunk those activities down into manageable and assignable portions, which are really easy to undertake. So the first thing that we encourage people to do when they're thinking about their marketing plans, and again, we've created a fairly simple marketing communications matrix, which is available for you to download just as a Word document from the SQ Enterprise page. So grab that and have a play around with it, and you'll sort of see that that marries into what I'm talking about here. But the first thing we really need to think about is who it is that we need to be marketing to. So we need to really just jot down on a piece of paper or a whiteboard all of the audiences that we need to be marketing to. A lot of people spend time marketing to audiences who simply don't really care about the marketing messages that they're sending out there. There's no point in telling all of your competitors or your peers in the industry how good you are or how awesome your products or services are if they're not going to actually buy from you. So once you've identified who's actually you need to actually market to, and these ideally are the people who either make the purchasing decision or at least influence the purchasing decision of your customers, then you need to consider what the right marketing channel is to reach those people. And they're again going to vary from business to business, but many of them will be the same. So again, in the little matrix we've given you, there's just some starters there, but it's going to be, they're just thought starters. What you actually use as marketing channels are going to be different from company to company. But once you have your list of channels and you have your list of target audiences, then we can start to marry those two together and we start to match them. So we start to figure out the right marketing channel to reach the right target audience. And it's important to be realistic here. So if you don't think that the head of commissioning of that US streaming service is actually going to be following you on Facebook, don't use Facebook to try to reach them. Be realistic about where the actual target audiences are really actually going to be able to be reached using the marketing channels available to you. The next thing to do is to think about the purpose of why you're using that channel to reach the audience. What are you actually trying to do with it? Is it about raising awareness? Are you actually trying to encourage them to make a purchasing decision on the spot? What's the rationale you're using to use that marketing channel to reach that audience in order to determine the content you're going to put on that channel? So thinking about why it is that you're using that channel to reach that audience allows you to think about what it is you're actually going to populate that marketing channel with. So the content needs to be specific to the audience, and it needs to be specific to the rationale that why you think they're going to be actually engaging with you there. Next, you need to think about how frequently you're going to be using that channel. Again, it's important to be realistic with this. It's much better from a marketing perspective to be doing small, regular activities than binging activities over short periods of time. So lots of activities all at once is easy from an effort perspective because you just put your shoulder to the wheel and get all those marketing activities done, but it means that you're not being consistent with your marketing approach, and so it's not necessarily going to be the best outcome because marketing works well when it layers on top of each other and accumulates over time. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be tactical about specific events or times of year. So if there are particular things which are happening at times of year where it makes sense to be engaging in particular marketing channels more than other times, then by all means do that. But it is important to sort of really look at the cadence of how regularly you're using each of those channels. And then lastly, you really want to think about who's the person responsible for engaging in the activity that you're going to be doing. Who's going to actually be driving that particular marketing activity, and then describing the process that they're going to use to engage with it. So it allows you then to potentially be delegating that task to somebody else on your team, or at least if it's you that's doing it, then you've got a really clear roadmap of what it is you need to do each time that you're doing that particular activity. So by breaking marketing down into those little manageable bite-sized chunks that you can either assign to yourself or set to your other team, it makes the whole process much simpler and relatively painless. And also means you can build a fairly robust marketing plan over a 12-month period that actually makes sense, aligns with whatever your objectives for your business are, and allows you to start to be much more strategic and tactical about how you're doing your marketing activities. So when you're looking at market attendance, for instance, which may well be one of your marketing activities from a networking perspective or from a sales perspective, then you can figure out when you're going to be doing those things and what other activities are worth doing in advance of or after that in order to make that the most effective sales tool you can. It is also important to, wherever you can, to measure the effectiveness of your marketing activities. So if you can set some sort of expectations for yourself of what success looks like for you in advance of starting a particular activity, then you can start to measure whether you've achieved the outcomes that you've wanted. And there's a lot of tools out there that you can use to measure those effectiveness. So have a look at some of those. Now, some of them are obvious, things like Google Analytics and things like that, or if you're using an ADM, a direct marketing tool for running newsletters, they'll give you open rates and things like that as well. So there's different ways of being able to use those types of things. One last slide before we go to a Q&A break and give you a chance to go and top up your tea. Just wanted to just touch on quickly, the key elements which are important to include in the strategic plan. Now, you have got the SQ template, which is there, but let me just take you through some of these things. So yes, as I say, very fortunate we've got the template for a business plan which Screen Queensland have given us. The main advice that we have when we're developing a strategic plan is you have to treat it like you're telling a story. It does need to be a narrative. Admittedly, unlike most stories, you need to give the ending away right up front, but ultimately the story still needs to hang together. The whole plan needs to really be able to make sense from a narrative, which is why when we're looking back at that environmental scan, it needs to make sense when we're starting to chunk down from a really broad environment scan to the specifics of your business. It needs to be a linear narrative throughout that whole process. You want to be able to provide a history and a context for your business. So explain to somebody who's reading this plan where you've come from and why it is that you have got to where you are and why it is that you're capable of doing what it is you're proposing you're going to do within your plan. You also want to demonstrate that you've analysed the market and the environment that you're operating, including your competitors. So all those things we've talked about already at the beginning of this session. We want to include all of those things in there. And then after we've done that, we want to really get to what our big idea is, the core of our business, the heart of the proposition. What is the key proposition that we're putting forward in this plan, which is going to be the thing which is going to drive our business forward. Once we've identified that and talked about that, we need to be able to talk about the resources that we need to be able to deliver against that proposition and demonstrate that we've really thought through how we're going to be able to deliver against that. So that includes telling the market about how great you are and what your products and services are. This is all of our marketing activities. And then lastly, when we've done all of that, we need to make sure that we have the numbers at work. So we need a finance model that clearly demonstrates the viability of the plan over a reasonable period of time. Now, a backwards planning model is really good for doing that simplistically and being able to show that there is viability in the model itself. You'll probably also want to do a slightly more detailed finance model as well, so you can really demonstrate that the numbers which underpin your business model really work. And it's really important that you take the time to genuinely understand those numbers for yourself, because it's the one area that you'll probably be interrogated on the most, especially if you're looking at getting some sort of investor, or even when you're applying for grants. It's the one area where the viability of your plan needs to really hang together from a financial perspective. And so being clear on your numbers and making sure that they are viable and realistic is really, really important as part of that whole process. Okay, well, look, I think we're running a little bit over, but I think let's pause for some questions and answers, and we'll stop sharing the screen. There we go.
And we do have a couple of questions that have come in, Ian. Meredith had a question about the competitor mapping, asking, do you determine the areas you're going to map by the elements that have arisen in the SWOT analysis? So do you map the competition according to those strengths and weaknesses that you identified?
Yeah, really good question, Meredith. Look, you can. As I said, what we tend to do is a few different versions of it because sometimes the first time you have a go at it, everything sort of really clearly maps out, and you can see some real trends emerging when you start to pick those axes. Other times you do it and you go, okay, that just looks like a complete dog's breakfast. It doesn't make any sense. It's not telling me anything useful. And so at that point we stop and we try doing the same process again, but using a different set of metrics to measure our business competitive, where we sit in that competitive landscape against our competitors. So, yes, it may well come from your strengths and weaknesses, and that's probably a good point to start. But it can come from any number of different places, and really it's worth just starting with one set of data and testing it to see what that looks like. And just by going through that process, you start thinking about the characteristics of who your competitors are, which can then help inform how you might do a second version of it or a third version of it. But it's not uncommon for us to do 4 or 5 different versions with different metrics until we sort of come up with something which actually then gives us something useful to actually measure against.
Yeah, interesting. I've certainly seen a version of it at an interstate production company, and they had a huge wall tracking all the projects that were in development and production in their specific genre, and tracking which companies were developing and which platforms and broadcasters and streaming services had commissioned or developed each one. So I can certainly see that it's already being used in the industry, and I think it's a really great tool. Judd also has a question more broadly across all of those analysis tools, whether if you're running vertically integrated businesses, would you recommend doing one across all of those businesses or splitting them out and doing them individually for each section?
Yeah, again, really good question. Look, when you're running a multifaceted business, you generally want to have done that type of analysis for each of the facets of your business. Often when you're running a vertically integrated business, you will have a business lead for each segment of your business. And so you would want each of those business leads to really be considering their own business plan, while you have a sort of a macro plan that might sit over top of everything. And certainly, that's probably going to take the form of some sort of synergy type plan. You really are looking at running independent business units within your corporate structure at that point, and they all need to make sense, in and of themselves, and be able to quite clearly demonstrate their commercial viability independently of each other. So while absolutely, it's important to also look in when you're starting to do vertical integration within businesses at the synergies that exist between each of your business units. But you really would want to actually incorporate that sort of planning at an individual business unit level.
Yeah. I'm going to answer this next question if you want to read on, Ian. The question is, do we need to follow the template on the SQ website for enterprise grants? It seems to be a little different from the strategic plan slide. So it is a slightly different format and a slightly different order. Certainly you can create your own document if you don't necessarily want to adapt that business plan, but it will have to have every element of that template in it. There will be an eligibility check as standard with all of our applications once that closing date has passed and you've submitted your application, and if there's anything missing, it will come back to you to update and include. Otherwise it will be obviously considered incomplete. So if you are looking at veering away from that template, please just make sure that you include all of the required parts. And then Judd's follow-on question, have you had a look at that, Ian? Creating a startup with an intention to sell. Given that most startups are built around proving a product and market in order to sell rather than the straight income, how do you best plan and map for that type of startup strategy?
Okay, yeah. So with a startup, look, with any business that you're looking at developing some sort of plan around, again, you need to make sure that it is commercially viable. So we usually use EBIT as a proxy for success on these sorts of businesses. So net profit is generally, when we're keeping score of whether a business is growing and succeeding and thriving, that tends to be the measure that we tend to use when we're trying to demonstrate viability. Obviously, when you look outside of the screen industry, at the tech sector in particular, EBIT's just one measure of success. And if you're trying to build a business to sell in that space, then it's not necessarily all going to just be around the revenues that you're generating. It's also around, your product and market fit, and how well you're actually getting your market penetration and things like that. But even then, ultimately, it has to be able to demonstrate that at some point in the future it's going to be able to pivot into some sort of profitability. So even if you're running a tech startup and you're selling it fairly early in the piece, it's because somebody can see that in the longer term they can take whatever it is that you've built and be able to turn that into something which is going to be profitable. So from the purpose of what we're talking about here, I would absolutely be suggesting that we use EBIT as the core metric for success when we're doing a startup. I hope that answers the question.
I think maybe we have one more question, do we? What's the value of a joint venture rather than a merger or an alliance versus a cooperative?
Okay. So joint ventures generally are that idea of dating before you get married sort of thing. So you're getting an opportunity to test a relationship with another business, oftentimes in an unincorporated manner. So even though they can be legally contracted, you haven't formally actually merged or brought the corporate structures together into a single entity. So it's a good test or way of testing to see how well two businesses can work together, how well their cultures integrate, how well their business processes and the way in which they go about doing businesses work together, how well their synergies in terms of either market or product fit, sort of how they can all come together, without necessarily having to take that next step of saying one or the other of us is actually going to formally merge with you or buy each other out. So where it works really well, especially in production environments, is where you potentially have a foreign company who works in another territory, and where you can enter into some sort of joint venture type arrangement where you can agree to represent their product domestically, and they can represent your product into those territories, and you can start that off by way of an unincorporated joint venture without necessarily needing to formalise that to begin with. And if it goes really well, there's no reason why down the track you wouldn't potentially look at using that as a stepping stone to then actually taking that into a more formal, incorporated sort of formal venture.
Okay, great. We've got one more question and then we might move on. Meredith's asking, with the backwards planning tool, just specific, I think, really to content creators where projects span across more than 1 year, yep. Do you scale the costs over different years?
Yep. So if it's going to run over 2 years, if you've got a project and you genuinely, and again, this is where this is very much a top line tool, but if you have a project which is going to run over year 1 and year 2, and you anticipate that your income streams and cost streams are probably going to be roughly married over that same period of time, then yes, put 0.5 into year 1 and 0.5 into year 2, or 0.25 into year 1, 0.75 into year 2. So the backwards planning model, because it is really for rapidly testing scenarios, isn't really getting to that level of granularity that you really get when you start building a detailed 3-way finance plan or something like that. A much deeper P&L and balance sheet and cash flow driven financial analysis. At that point, especially if it's a slate driven P&L, then you really are getting into the timing of, when does this project start and finish, and you're apportioning that timing much more granularly, but with the backwards planning, then just keep it fairly top line. Absolutely fine to be using fractions when you're putting in the volumes in those years.
Okay, great. Should we launch into part 2?
Yeah, excellent. I'll try to keep the second part a little bit quicker because we've only got 20 minutes or so. So So I will share my screen again. Okay. So the second half of this session, we're really focusing on business development and identifying the characteristics of projects that you want your business to be focusing on in the future. So in order to know what it is that you want to make, you really need to think about who you are. And sometimes what we do, and we're doing this with clients and people who participated in SQ Hub business sessions with us before, many of you would have done this with us already, but so you'll be familiar with this sort of model. But this is kind of a brand essence type of workshop. Sometimes you can articulate this in the way of a company mission statement, and this isn't dissimilar to that in some ways. There's 5 things that we consider when we're going through this process, and they're not in any particular order. Well, the first 4 are in a particular order. The first 4 can be done in any order. The 5th one you can do at the end. So the first thing you want to do is to think about what it is that you do. So single words or short sentences are really good in this. So put that into that top quadrant of what it is that we do. What is our actual business activities? How do we describe what it is that our business does? Secondly, we're going to look at our culture or the personality of our business. What are the emotive words or phrases that encapsulate what our business is? Sometimes when we're doing this with people, we ask them to think about, is there a particular character or personality that really embodies your corporate culture? So is there some celebrity that you think really, kind of, when you think of them, that's the sort of personality which is embodied within our organisation? The next one that we look at is our unique proposition. So what is it that sets us apart from our peers and competitors? What is it that's unique about our business that makes us, stand out from the crowd, and which, makes people want to engage with us for what it is that we do? So is there a particular area that we focus in on? Is it a genre? Is it a type of game for a games company? Is it what are the elements of it? Is it the style of the dialogue? Is it, and so on and so forth. So you can, what's our unique proposition? And then lastly, in that bottom right-hand quadrant, we use what's the source of authority? So why should people believe that we say that we can do what we say we can do? So what is our source of authority? What backs up our credentials? Have we won awards? How can we demonstrate? Can we point at some other, capability or experience that we've had, which gives us a source of authority to be able to demonstrate what it is that we've really got the capabilities to be able to deliver against what we say we're going to do. So again, with each of these quadrants, we're really just keeping it to start with in just 1 or 2 words or short sentences. You don't need to fill them in any particular order. Jump around all over the place when you're thinking about your business and thinking about the characteristics of it. Really, what you want to try to do is to get maybe 10 or 15 words or phrases in each one of those quadrants. And then at the end of all of that, what we encourage people to do is to sort of sit back and look at those and then circle or highlight those phrases or words which really best embody what it is. There's generally, a few phrases or sentences or words in each of those quadrants which really specifically align to what it is that your business is and what the essence of your brand is going to be. And so we circle or highlight those in some way. And then finally, what we do is we try to bring those all together into a single sentence or phrase in the middle of this document, which then unifies that into a single phrase, which is either a brand essence or a mission statement of here's what it is that we are and what it is that we do. So this is just a fairly simple way of breaking your thinking up when you're trying to articulate what your company's essence or what your mission statement is. Instead of just trying to describe just one element of it, we really want you to consider all sorts of different facets of what it is that your brand represents and what it stands for, so that when you then go about trying to put that sentence together at the end, it's much more meaningful and probably it's going to resonate more with you and probably describes to your audience better what it is that you represent as well. So that's who you are. The next thing which once you've figured that out, so once you have a clear picture of your mind of what it is that you feel that your business is and what it stands for, it's easier to start thinking about what sorts of projects you feel that you should be working on as an organisation and why. So these should align back to what it is that your brand actually stands for. Some businesses we work with have very diverse and varied slates, and that can really confuse the market and the people they're pitching to. So if they're pitching a really serious factual documentary one day and then a light entertainment show the next and then a feature film the next, it's just confusing as to people as to what it is that that company actually does. So it's really important to have a good alignment between your projects and your brand so the clients can understand what it means to be engaging with you on your projects, and ideally going back to those 4 quadrants so they can understand why you've got the authority to actually deliver against a project, you've got the experience, the personality of your organisation marries against what it is that they're expecting to get from you, so they can understand what it means to buy a project from you. Or if it's not a project, if you have a product, again, you want to make sure that it's clear as to what that actually means. What's really important to each creative business is going to vary. So depending on what's important to you, then you may want to assess what you actually want to put on your slate or the projects you're working on in a different way. So there's quite a few different characteristics that we have seen people use when they're assessing project fit over the years. And these include things like IP ownership. So who owns what rights? So what we're looking at here is when we're thinking about whether we're going to add a project onto our slate of projects that we're working on, whether or not it actually marries against our core values of what it is that we're actually putting to, wanting to focus in on. So IP ownership, who owns what rights, is really important for many companies. Not necessarily for you, but these are some of the key ones that we see. The quality of the creative, so what's the pedigree of the writer or the creator? It may be you are the writer or creator, in which case it may not actually be as relevant again, but if it's a third-party project which you're assessing, then understanding its pedigree and where it's coming from is really important. Are there any intangible benefits associated with this particular project? So is there some non-obvious benefit, either in terms of capability or reputation or relationship development, which the project allows you to do, which isn't necessarily tied to a financial metric? So what are those intangible benefits the project brings to you? So oftentimes, with businesses which are either moving into a new area where they haven't got a lot of experience, they'll do it by way of a co-production to begin with, even though it might be less commercially lucrative for them. It gives them some other intangible benefit in terms of capabilities or reputation, so it's worth exploring. The scale of the project in terms of its turnover is often something which is important for people to consider. You can put a lot of effort into doing small projects. You can put an equally large, the same amount of effort can go into delivering a large project or a medium-sized project. So having turnover as one of the metrics which you might be considering when you're looking at it, the scale of a project is something as to whether it should go into your slate or not, may be worth considering. One of the hardest ones to quantify, but which oftentimes is most important for people, is whether or not the project you're looking at either fits with the zeitgeist or has some X factor around it, something which really wows you and which you think is which really stands aside from the rest of the offerings in the marketplace. So it's sometimes difficult to articulate what that is, but people generally will know whether or not that project has that, and sometimes will want to actually use that as part of their analysis of whether or not that project should be something they're going to pursue. Marketing demand, so whether or not market demand, whether there's actually, we know that there's a demand in the market for a particular type of product or service. So if we have heard from somebody who is buying these things that they are after a particular type of product or service or project type, then that's important to know. And when we're looking at a project, we also want to consider whether or not we know that there is a demand in the market for a particular type of show. So, again, this is talking more in shows, but the same could be applicable against games and other creative outputs as well. Profitability, so the actual margins you make off the project. So just because you have a very large turnover on a project doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have great profitability, especially if you're doing it in a co-production environment, for instance, as I talked about earlier. So you might be halving your margin or even less in that sort of instance, but there may be some other benefits for doing so. But margin may be the key critical thing that you really want to be focusing in on for your business. So it's absolutely something which you might want to consider measuring as part of this process. Speed of delivery. So how fast can we actually turn this project around? If it was greenlit today, how quickly can we take it into market? This is actually really important right now for screen businesses in particular, because as we come out of the pandemic that we're currently in, and as production cycles start to take up again, speed of delivery will be really one of those critical things which a lot of commissioners will be looking at in terms of how quickly they can actually get a product turned around and on screen in order to actually prioritise what they're going to be buying first. Complexity in financing. So how complex is the financing model? How long is it going to take to actually pull together the financing on a particular project? So this is, again, we're talking about projects which are in development and fairly early stage of development. So how complex are you prepared your financing plan to be? If it's really important for you to be very simple, then that might allow you to prioritise one project over another. Creative control. How much creative control are you going to have over the project? If it's your own project, obviously you'll have complete creative control over it. Again, that may be diluted somewhat depending on the broadcaster or whoever it is that you're talking to, and the level of control that they want to have over it. Formatability, so is this a format that you're developing, or is it just a one-off project? Is it something which can be turned into a format? Again, that may not be relevant for your particular business, but for some businesses that's really important because they're looking for returnable series or the capacity to actually format something and sell it as a format to create additional income streams outside of actually having to do production. Repeatability, which is the second part of that, is also really important. So is this something which can go to series, or is it just going to be a one-off project? Obviously, series can be more lucrative because the investment you've spent on development and the relationship and actually getting the project live the first time it's easy to get a second repeat of something if it's done well. So if a series is repeatable and can go to series, or if a show can go to series, then obviously that for some people is going to be important. And lastly, audience. Is there a particular audience that you really specialize in, or which is important to you? So you may just be a kids producer, for instance, and so you really need to consider whether or not the projects you're working on have a neat fit with the audience that you're known for, and which you really really want to be focusing in on. So really understanding all those different elements, and again, they're going to be different between every company as to what it is that you want to assess your project slate on the basis of, but having a list of at least some of those so that you can start to compare diverse projects, especially when they have got quite different characteristics, is really important. What we're really trying to get to here is being able to then potentially even, map these into some other way where we can then give a project either a score or a weight, or a way of being able to visualize where it sits compared to the other things which you're considering focusing on in your business. And also, we like to, if possible, generate what we call a meta score. So to actually assign a score against each of these characteristics and come up with a mark for that particular project out of 100 against what it is that we're actually measuring. Now, that model itself is quite complex. I will take you through the maths of it just really quickly for those of you who are interested. Basically, what we're looking at here is if we have 7 categories that we are interested in measuring our business, our slate against. So, for instance, some might be the market demand, profitability, turnover, complexity in financing, formatability, and audience. So we look at each of those categories. What we then need to do is apply a weight to each of those, because not each of those categories or each of those characteristics is going to be equally important to you. So whichever one is most important to you, want to be giving a higher weight. Whichever one is less important to you, you want to be giving a lesser weight to. It's fine for you to have multiple categories there with the same weighting. And look, in some instances, you may have equal weighting across all categories, but ultimately, what we want to do is to try to understand whether or not one or more of those categories are more important to you as a production company or as a developer than others. What we then use that to do is to generate a multiplier. So that second column, and I'll explain what that is in just a second, is then our weighting average that we use when we're actually trying to figure out what the actual score of a particular project is. I'll come back to that one in a moment. The third column, after we've set up our weighting against each of our categories, our third column is really a score for a particular project. So that's going to vary from project to project. When you consider each project, in this instance, I've given it a score out of 10. You can do it a score out of 5 if you want to. You can do it a score out of 3, whatever you want. But let's call it, we can do a score out of 100 if you wanted to as well. For the sake of simplicity, I've called this a score out of 10. So when we're considering each project, under each of these categories, we score how it is doing, with 10 being better and 0 being poor, against each of the categories that we've said are important to us. And then we multiply our multiplier column by a score column to give us an adjusted score, which then adds up to a meta score. Now, in theory, if everything in this model got a score out of 10 in our column there, which is our score, if each of those was a 10, our meta score would be 100. But that same set of numbers, if it was applied to different categories, you'll have a different meta score because the weighting is different between each of them. So let me just explain that weighting multiplier quickly. The maths behind that is that we look at the particular weighting in the second column here. So category 1 has a weighting of 10. If we added together all of those weighting scores, in this instance, they add up to 52. So 10 plus 7 plus 6 plus 5 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 equals 52. So we look at 10 over 52. And then we're going to multiply that by whatever our score out of 100 is. So in this instance, we're scoring it out of 10, so we divide 100 by 10. So it's our weighting divided by the total number of all of our weightings multiplied by, in this instance, 10. So 10 times 52 times 10 equals, so 10 over 52 times 10 equals 1.92. So that's the weighting average there. Again, if you want to have a look at one of these models, I can absolutely share you an Excel document, but because each of these categories is so varied between each client that we work with, it's very difficult to give you a sort of a baseline one to work with. But this is the maths that underpins, if you wanted to go through the process of generating a meta score or an Excel model to be able to do this, this is what it looks like. The second thing that these models allow us to do is to actually start to then map out visually what it is that the characteristics of a particular project has against those things which are important to us. So I've just given again an example here of a sample project where we've mapped it against, I think it's 10 different characteristics, and they all have different weightings. We've given each of those characteristics a score out of 10, and then we've generated a meta score for this particular project. But you can sort of very quickly see in this instance where the strengths and weaknesses of this particular project are. In this instance, it's really got very simple financing. We're able to exploit the rights really easily. It's got some good intangible benefits, but it's actually quite small in terms of size and scale. So its weaknesses are perhaps its size and scale, the market opportunity and the X factor a little bit lower than we'd like it to be, and so on. So yeah, these sorts of ways of being able to analyze different projects are useful in that when you're looking at your slate of projects, it allows you to really rapidly compare very diverse projects and to start to prioritize what concepts you want to actually be working on. When you've got a finite resource base to be able to work on development with, then you obviously can't work on every project that comes across your desk. And so being able to prioritize and figure out which ones are most important for you can be really useful. And that's where the meta score also comes into it. It sounds a bit, counterintuitive in some ways to go, well, this one has a higher score than that one, so I've got to do this one. But if you have properly actually come up with the right questions you want to be asking about it, and you've allocated the correct weightings to each of those characteristics, then the meta score is actually a really useful tool to be able to use to quickly compare different and compare and contrast different projects you might be able to work on. I think we are going to run a little bit over, so please just bear with me. If you have to go, that's absolutely fine. I think we'll probably be about another maybe 5 to 10 minutes, but I'll try to go through these next ones relatively quickly. Next thing I wanted to talk about was sales management tools. So sales and business development really is, at the end of the day, a numbers game. Again, it's something which creative people working in creative businesses often don't like doing, is selling. And while marketing, which we talked about earlier, is really good in terms of raising your profile, getting you known, getting you perhaps the meeting to be able to go and pitch something to somebody, sales is really about getting the right information in front of the right people at the right time. And, you know, when it comes to many of the projects that we're working on in creative industries, it's important to realise that we have a relatively low strike rate, so a fairly low success rate on pitches for creative industries. It's not that your idea isn't right, it's just that there's so many different competing ideas which are being pitched to people at any given time that oftentimes, you know, almost always, most production businesses will have a relatively low strike rate, so we need to be constantly doing sales in order to be able to keep that turnover of opportunities high enough to be able to keep our pipeline full. One of the most successful television businesses in Australian history was Grundy Productions, which you probably know of. And even they, at the height of you know, their production, when they were doing Sale of the Century and Neighbours and all these things, they still only had a 1 out of 20 strike rate. So of every 20 ideas they pitched to television networks, only one of them would get up. But, you know, they were pitching an awful lot, admittedly. And there was a lot fewer networks back then than there are today in terms of places you could potentially be pitching your ideas to. But it's really important to be considering your sales and mapping your pipeline, understanding the different stages that you have of what your sales process looks like. Again, we've provided a sample document, sales document on the SQ Enterprise site for you to be able to download. It's an Excel document. It was created by a company called Pipedrive, and there's some instructions in there as to how to use it. Pipedrive also have a CRM product, a customer relationship management product, which is just a cloud-based version of that Excel model, which has got a few more smarts that's behind it as well. There's lots of other CRMs which are out there, which are really good, and it's absolutely worth doing some research to find ones that actually going to suit you best, because what they allow you to do is to combine a database of potential prospects with the pipeline of activities that you need to take, and then to sort of manage each of your projects to make sure that you don't let things fall through the cracks. You keep in contact with the right people, you schedule activities to follow up on projects as they move forward. You can keep notes on how things are actually, what response you're getting from people, and continue to refine your pitches and your information as you move forward based on the data you're getting as you're going through your sales process. You can also see with CRM tools the conversion ratios at each of those stages of your sales pipeline. So from getting a meeting to getting a pitch, from getting a pitch to actually getting greenlit, you can start to measure your success rates at each of those things. And then you can see where you might need to improve your skills or your capabilities based on where you're getting a drop off or an unusual conversion ratio from one of those stages to the next. Let's talk about pitch very quickly. So pitching, and look, there are lots of materials out there for pitching. It's something which the screen industry does talk about a lot. I'm not going to suggest that I'm an expert on pitching because I'm not working directly in production anymore, but certainly, I have spent many years working in media and advertising and in television production, and, have sat in on many, many pitches over the years. The key thing to remember, obviously, is preparation. So you need to really prepare for your pitches, not just your materials. You also need to prepare yourself. Remember that people are buying not just what you're selling, they're also buying you. So it's really important that when you're going into a pitch situation that you're presenting yourself in the best possible light as well. Absolutely prepare all of your materials in advance. Make sure you have the essence of your idea really clearly articulated. When you've got multiple projects, log lines are really important. And even if you don't have multiple projects, log lines are really important to be able to sort of really encapsulate what an idea is very, very succinctly. It's worth, I know it sounds a bit naff, but it's worth watching shows like Dragon's Den and Shark Tank just to see what works and what doesn't, seeing how people stumble, seeing where people do really well, understanding what style of pitching is going to work for you. So seeing lots of, actually observing how people go about pitching is actually a really good way of learning about how to do it yourself. It's really important to know your audience. So whoever it is you're pitching to, you'd want to know who they are. You want to read about them, talk to people who know them, know what they're interested in, know what they're buying at the moment. So wherever you can do that sort of research to understand the audience, absolutely do that in advance. When it comes to the pitch itself, you need to practice and practice and then practice. It's really important to continue to have that absolutely down pat, so that when you walk in, you're confident, you know that you're not going to stumble over a particular area. And a second part to that in particular is know your numbers and know your data. So when somebody says, okay, that's really interesting, what's the budget? Make sure you've got that information up front and you're really clear on all of that data from the get-go. Be really clear about what it is you're asking for. Lastly, it's really important to listen and take on feedback. As I said, strike rate in creative industries tends to be low. It's not a critique of your idea. It's not a criticism of you. It's just that there's an awful lot of competing priorities and lots of people asking for a fairly small pool of resources. So it's important just to learn and evolve and find opportunities. So take on feedback. Don't take it as emotional feedback. Just take it as intended, as, you know, learn from it and figure out how you can do better for next time. Last slide, and I'll try to keep this one short, is specifically looking at innovation and prototyping. So ideating and innovation. So innovation isn't easy. It's trying new things and thinking about things in new ways takes time and effort. It's relatively easy to be derivative and repeat what other people are already doing, but it's not going to make you into the next Pixar or the next id Software. So it's really important to take that time to really try to stop and step outside of your day-to-day to be able to think about how you can innovate and ideate. Prototyping is one way of doing it. Sometimes prototypes can be a new product or service. Sometimes it's a new way of doing things. Sometimes it's a different type of storytelling. But it's important to take time to explore new ideas and to make sure that they align to the essence of what your brand is and what your business is as well. One of the other things you can consider doing once you have the idea for a different way of doing things is to build a minimum viable product, MVP. In doing so, you actually learn by doing what the pain points are going to be in advance. So by doing a minimum product, you can actually see how it's going to work. Don't forget about the R&D process. For those of you that work in more technical elements of the creative industries, you may already be accessing R&D grants, but even if you're not, the actual R&D process itself and what's expected of you is actually an important process to go through by hypothesizing what it is you're anticipating is going to be the outcome of whatever it is you're researching or developing, documenting the process you go through and testing that. So having that scientific method is really important. And if you are eventually going to actually start to tap into R&D grants, it's a really important process to start to follow, because trying to go back and retroactively create all of that documentation is incredibly difficult. Encourage your staff to innovate. You've got, you know, great teams around you. Give them the time and space, and if it is possible, it doesn't necessarily need to be big. Give them budget to explore new things. But, you know, time consuming and because it is time consuming, because it does, you know, require brain power, sharing that load and encouraging lots of different brains to be thinking about different ways of doing things is a really good way of doing that. Failure is good. Don't be afraid of it. When possible, learn from other people's mistakes. But the whole point of prototyping and testing things is to figuring out what doesn't work as much as what does work. It's really important to understand the market as well. So read a lot. Research is cheap, but it can save you an awful lot if you can take the time to do it again. But more than anything, give yourself the time and the space to stop and think and to get past the noise and to really start to think about some of those ways in which you could be doing things differently and innovatively. Okay, we have run over, so I'm sorry about that. I'll stop now and we can take a couple more questions.
Thank you, Ian. That was great. Lots of valuable information there. Bobby Lee has a couple of questions. I'm going to start with the easiest first. Do you have any recommendations for project management software, CRM software?
Oh, look, there's lots of different ones out there. Again, there's a few new products which are very specific to film and television, which have just started to come onto the market, which you might want to have a look at. from purely a CRM perspective, which is very much a sales management tool, there's quite a few free ones out there. Things like Untitled have got free versions, which integrates directly with the Google Suite. Pipedrive, which is the guys that made the Excel document, which is available for you to download from the SQ enterprise site, have got a product called Pipedrive, which is a cloud-based one, which I find really, really good. It's I think it's about $11 US a month for an entry-level user. So look, you know, there's lots of different ones out there. Obviously, there's things like Asana and Trello and things like that you could use as well. So it's just really finding the right tools which really go to fit with what it is that is right for you. And if you're already using some of those tools in other parts of your business, then it might be easier for you to simply adapt those ones into what you're doing. The thing which I would probably just urge you to look at is how well those products talk to other systems. So if they've got a really, you know, good API first approach to the way in which they've set themselves up, it'll probably make life easier for you down the track. Pipedrive, as an example, has got good G Suite integration, but it also talks directly to MailChimp and to a bunch of other, EDM platforms like that. So, and they've got a whole app marketplace of other integrations you could look at. So just have a look to see that you can actually integrate these products with whatever else you're using in your business.
Mm-hmm. And then she has another question about fitting projects into your brand. They have a really diverse slate covering all formats and most genres, but as a brand, we focus on social issues and diversity. So the stories, whether factual or narrative, will revolve around that. Is that branding enough to be able to have a large, diverse slate and not confuse people as to our brand?
Look, a large, diverse slate's not bad as long as there's a commonality to it which aligns to your brand. So you know, I suppose the question you need to really ask yourself there, and again, this is where it comes down to weighting priorities when you're looking at what's going to go into your slate, is, and one of the characteristics which we have absolutely seen people put into their analysis of when they're looking at whether a project should be on their slate is how well it aligns to their brand. So in your instance, it may well make sense to have that as one of the things that you're really looking at, because I think, you know, if you're focusing on social issues and diversity in the stories, and that is the common thread throughout all of your projects, and that aligns back to your brand itself, then that's fine. So again, it is about not confusing people. So when they look at it, they don't go, okay, but you've got this particular story which is around diversity and social issues, and then this thing over here which is a cooking show. I mean, how do these two relate to each other? So as long as there's that commonality to them, and people understand that relates back to your core brand, then that's fine.
That's great. I think that's wrapped up all the questions. I did have a few, but seeing as we're over time, we might leave those. Thank you so much, Ian. That has been so valuable, and I know that everyone would have got a lot out of that. We are, as Ian has said, we are putting all the resources up on our website, and I know those of you who have asked for that multiplier example that Ian spoke about, I will speak to Ian about how we get that to you if we don't put that on the website, but we'll talk about that offline. And I just wanted to do a very quick shout out. I know yesterday I alluded to an announcement. Today we have rolled out a new program which is on our website. So if you head over to our website, there is some information about a new opportunity as well. So perfect timing for you to be able to pivot to a new opportunity.
And look, I will do that updated version of the backwards planning tool too. So just maybe wait for, or check that again this evening. I'll make sure that new version is just a couple of logic errors in there, which I'll fix.
And both of these sessions, just to let you all know, both of these sessions were of course recorded, and I should be able to get them uploaded to our website by tomorrow afternoon. So if not by then, definitely by Friday. So if you're wanting to revisit anything or listen to the recordings over again, they will be available on the website by then. And a big thank you to Ian and Casey for all of your hard work and doing such an amazing job on this. And thank you to everyone for joining us. we might close off there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ian. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Ian. Bye.